Your Excellency, Governor General, Honorable Prime Minister, Leader of the Opposition. I almost said all protocols observed. Commissioners, and other distinguished ladies and gentlemen. This is a very, very happy occasion for me. I start by thanking the Prime Minister for inviting me to be part of this wonderful initiative that should give hope to St. Lucia. Planning is essentially an activity that looks to the future. In fact, if you have no interest in the future, then you need not plan. And that future can be 24 hours or 24 years. I dare say that St. Lucia's best days are ahead, and therefore you need to focus on the future. Small societies like Jamaica and St. Lucia, with limited resources and having very little control over the global forces that buffet us on a daily basis, very often have very little time to focus on the long term and focus instead on crisis management. And I speak here from experience in the Planning Institute of Jamaica, where we were set up in 1955 to do central planning, national planning. But after the first oil crisis of the 1970s, we essentially joined that group that was focused almost exclusively on crisis management. Whether that crisis was in relation to the oil crisis, the global recession of the 1980s, or the challenges that the end of preferences presented to us in the Caribbean, or dealing with the great recessions, the recession that we're just trying to get out of. We were all focused to a large extent on managing day-to-day crisis in what is then known as the tyranny of the immediate. The best intellectual resources of the region or individual countries have to find time to deal with crisis management. Leaders facing the next election often are impatient with long-term planners like myself. They are sometimes impatient with visionaries who are not immediately part of the political process. They need quick solutions to real-world problems, and therefore, very often, tomorrow is always a better day to die. This is a strong operating philosophy in many bureaucracies across the Caribbean. However, we know that in the long run, countries that have not paid attention to the long-run issues of planning, leadership, and management will not succeed. There will always be a tension between strategic planners and political leadership. Planners look to the future. Often political leaders have to solve today's problems, as I said. And this tension is healthy, because guess what? We have to do both. And resources are scarce, both in terms of time, money, and other resources. And therefore you have to make choices. And in debating those choices, tension will emerge. Comprehensive strategic planning in a small, resource-poor society like ours is not a simple exercise. The capacity and effectiveness of the state is somewhat limited, and our ability to focus on long-term issues also limited. The good news, however, is that we have ideas. We have resources. Limited as it may be, we have resources. There's sufficient capital available to fund good ideas and projects. And my emphasis here is on good. Long-term visioning and planning is an intense exercise that requires patience and diligence. It is a process-driven exercise. It is not an event. Mr. Chairman, you have a long task ahead of you, as you say. But in the Caribbean, We're a society that enjoys the excitement of carnival, calypso-type cricket, and we also enjoy the 100-meter dash. We don't like races that last too long. We become impatient and we lose attention. In Jamaica, one of our national heroes, Norman Manley, spoke of our lack of a fixity of purpose. We have ideas, but we keep losing our way because we do not fix our purpose and work towards it. But we also suffer from the futility of planning for the short term from a partisan perspective. We have a very long history in Jamaica of 5-year development plans, which we started in the 1940s. These plans often coincide with the political term of the party in office. So they were often an attempt to concretize, from a public policy perspective, what was written in the manifesto of the winning party. Very often, there was not enough time to do the plans and to start effective implementation before the start of the next election cycle. If the plan is finished and the party in office loses, the plan became a waste of financial and intellectual capital. And very often, public servants and others who were involved in that process became cynical and disillusioned. This political approach to planning, after a generation, has lost credibility. We had to find a new way to plan in Jamaica. Vision 2030 represented such an attempt. And I remember very distinctly, as part of our planning process, we went around the country prior to any planning exercise, in conjunction with the UNDP, which was then led by Dr. Gillian Lindsay Nanton. And we had an exercise called civic dialogue, where we went into communities and we asked people what future they wanted to create for themselves. How did they see Jamaica and what future they wanted for Jamaica. And that exercise led us to the conclusion that we had to find a new way to engage people and to plan for the future of Jamaica. And I remember going to the Minister of Finance and engaging at the political directorate the need for us to have a long-term plan. And once that was accepted, we went to the cabinet and the Prime Minister endorsed this on the condition that it had to be a national exercise, not a government exercise, not a party exercise, but a national exercise which involved the opposition and involved the business community, involved civil society, trade unions, and other NGOs. On that basis, we started this exercise. And it took quite some time. It was over 2 years in the making. But very importantly, it was a process which saw the government sanctioning, for the first time, the involvement of the opposition. And as luck, or depending on your perspective, as bad luck would have it, just before the plan was completed, there was a change of administration. But because we were engaged on both sides, once the administration settled down, they had the good fortune of launching this plan. And in attendance was the new opposition, who were previously the government, endorsing an exercise that was truly a national effort and a national exercise. This was a first in Jamaica's history. We have a very robust political process. But consensus was achieved, not by the planning process alone, but by just what has happened in the world. The end of the Cold War, globalization, and the limited degrees of freedom in terms of policy that we have, that there was a consensus that emerged. And the planning process and the planning exercise was a culmination of this. And so it was not a difficult exercise to get the leadership to agree. However, we had to start somewhere. And one of the key areas of to start was to get people to abandon the mindset that leads to failure and stagnation. That was deep in the culture. My colleague spoke of the anti-growth coalition. My phrase was the mindset that leads to failure and stagnation. It amounts to the same thing. We had to be brutally honest in analyzing and understanding why previous processes failed and why we were where we were. And we had to present the findings to the political leadership on all sides, because there was more than enough blame to go around. We had to show where each contributed to the successes and to the failure. And we had to invite them to change. But we had to do so with a process that was genuinely balanced and genuinely fair. And it could not be a cosmetic exercise. It had to be genuine involvement. It was not about point scoring. And we had to ensure that people felt that they were contributing to a national process that had meaningful contributions to make. To be successful, the planning process must be led by a professional institution or organization with integrity and competence. You can't ignore the need for technical competence to put a plan together. We can go around and we can get all the views and write a nice story, but at the end of the day, if you're going to have an integrated plan that will draw on the reality, the global reality, the realities in the region, to balance our resource availability, and to chart a course, you have to have technical competence underpinning that process. Very importantly, the lead institution must have national acceptance. The plan can never and should never be developed by outsiders. Outsiders can play some role in terms of technical inputs and support, but it has to be support. It cannot be leading, it cannot be the main thing. Your plan that you're developing, it must be a St. Lucian plan. If it is not, it will never be owned, and if it is not owned, it will never be implemented. And if it is not implemented, it is a grand waste of effort. I know you're not involved in failure, and you do not want to fail. The central question to be addressed, in my mind, is how do we plan and create the future that is better than the present and one that is sustainable? A future that everyone has a stake in, a future that is rooted in the best cultural values that the majority of St. Lucians cherish and want to take forward. This issue of culture and cultural values is central to the ownership and success of the process. This can only be achieved as a national effort. It will die a very quick death if it is rooted in sectional and or partisan interests. What are my views of what we should include in the national visioning and planning exercise? It has to take place at 3 distinct levels. At the national level, you have the leadership of the Prime Minister, the leader of the opposition, the Parliament, the heads of public and national institutions. But very importantly, you have to go to the grassroots, to the mass organizations, students, the young, workers, sectional interests, industries. And when I look at the composition here, I'm very heartened because you have moved way ahead of my thoughts on this in terms of the composition of your National Commission. There must also be the technical and professional input that will come from organizations that do research. Your university-trained and your educational institutions, think tanks. If you do not do it this way, you're not going to have the buy-in and the ownership and the support. And if you do not have that, you're not going to succeed. This is a very difficult undertaking if it's going to be meaningful. It is fraught with danger. Some will try to hijack it, some will try to kidnap it, some may even try to terrorize and kill it if it is not going their way. The anti-growth coalition is not going away. But the leadership of the process must be prepared to stand up and see it through. And in your leader, and in his words, and in my conversation with him last night, I'm convinced that he is going to stand up and he's going to see it through. You have started with a visioning process that should lead, or should start from the notion that prosperity, being a prosperous, being a more just, and being a more secure, and having a more secure future is the foundation. That's the future you want to create. A prosperous, just, and secure future. A future of inclusion. A future where people will not lose their identity of who they are. You have to start with the assumption that St. Lucians love being St. Lucians. They don't want a plan or a vision that will attempt to make them something that they are not. They just want a better life in a fundamental way. The focus should be on the children, the next generation. If we spend too much time talking about leaders of the past and what was done and who did what to whom, the process will be divided, it will become bogged down, and will get you nowhere. There are some stylized facts that we need to recognize. We can't ignore them, but they should not become hindrances that will prevent you from completing your job. These are challenges, but they're also opportunities. Like Jamaica, St. Lucia is a relatively small economy, which means that the size of your population will not allow you to sell goods only to St. Lucian and become prosperous. You have to look to the wider global market. You have to produce goods and services that the international market wants. And the earlier presentation suggested strategies about how this can be done. Some binding constraints we face. We have foreign capital availability is a constraint. So we have to create the mechanism, we have to create the means by which we will attract foreign capital. We have a very narrow economic export base, but we can do better. We have the means through technology. But more importantly, we have the brain. We have the brain power, which is the key ingredient in the new economy of the world. And St. Lucia has a unique demonstration of this in the production or the gift to the world of 2 Nobel Prize laureates. You have what it takes. It's in your DNA. You have demonstrated it. You don't have to guess about it. You have the intellectual capacity to do so. But we're also international market price takers for commodities. We can't dictate to the market in that sense in terms of price when you're producing commodities. If you're producing products, new ideas, you're better able to dictate price. But if you're producing commodities, bananas, you have to be a price taker. And these are realities you have to face. So you have to change the product mix, so to speak. We have the difficulty of shifting resources between tradable and non-tradable sectors of the economy. These are realities. We have to find ways to move labor more readily from non-tradables into tradables, because the domestic market, and I dare say even the CARICOM market, is not sufficient to make you prosperous to the level that you want to be going forward in the future. The economy, as we know, is subject to serious international shocks, and we have to absorb some of these shocks even while we adjust. These are realities that we have to face, and we have to adjust with intermittent planning processes over the long haul of your vision. This difficult environment is a context in which we have to plan the future. In the short to medium term, our economies have no other way but to absorb some of these shocks, but we have the capacity to adjust. The attempt to manage the current difficult process solely by fiscal consolidation is proving extremely difficult. But we have to do it. We have to adjust. If you do not have the resources and you have the demand, but you don't have the revenue, you have to find ways of adjusting even while you attempt to grow. These are realities we are facing in Jamaica. I dare say the rest of the region, if they're not doing so already, may have to do so. But these are some of the constraints we face. Finally, I'd like to suggest some guiding principles that we have found very useful in developing our long-term visioning process. It is not sufficient to just turn to the population and say, tell us what to do. We have to go to the population with some ideas as a guide. Not that they are dumb and don't know what to say. They have their views. They have survived. They have demonstrated the ability to survive and to generate ideas that make a living. But if we're going to them and we have ideas, they have schooled us, they have educated us, we should go back with some ideas to share. And they will tell you, you're talking foolishness, this is what we think, and ideas will bubble up. So what do we go to them to say? We have to start with the notion that this is a process of transformation. It requires transformational leadership, not just from the Prime Minister and from the leader of the opposition, but all the institutions, trade unions, the church. You have to be thinking about transforming the society into something new and better. It must be a partnership. Common good over vested interests must be a guiding principle. There must be transparency and accountability in the process. And by this I mean the effective functioning of government for the social well-being of all. There must be a spirit of social cohesion, building social capital, valuing the ideas that come up from the ground, not thinking that because we are from a particular institution, we have a superior knowledge. So social cohesion, building social capital, understanding, empathizing, sympathizing where needs be with the ideas and helping people to come forward with their ideas, shaping them. This engenders a sense of ownership and belonging in the citizens. The fifth principle or notion that I think would be important is this notion of equity. And by equity, I mean facilitating the equality of opportunity. that the system that you're developing, the process that we're trying to put forward, will allow people this sense of equity, fairness in terms of opportunities. And finally, it's a notion of sustainability, to ensure that this prosperity that we're building is integrated across the social, economic, and political spheres of our society. But also, very importantly, the integration of environmental and physical planning that enhance the well-being of the society and building for the future. This is what the whole long-term process is about: building a prosperous, peaceful, secure future for our children. I want to wish you good luck in this very, very difficult but worthwhile endeavor. It is worth doing and doing well. Thank you very much.